The opening of Herbert Howe's A Hymn for St. Cecilia, an appropriate way to begin this podcast in which we explore a new album celebrating the musical life of the Chapel of St. John's College, Cambridge, in the company of their Director of Music, Andrew Nethsingha. More on that soon. I'm Martin Cullingford, editor of Gramophone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Gramophone Podcast, given in association with Leipzig, the city of music, and its two renowned flagships, the Opera Leipzig, as well as the Gewandhaus zu Leipzig. Besides the great J.S. Bach, Leipzig has played host to many musicians, including Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy, who, as well as being music director of the great Gewandhaus Orchestra, founded the city's first conservatory in 1843. Robert and Clara Schumann, Richard Wagner and Gustav Mahler all worked in the city. In May 2023, the Gewandhaus Orchestra will host a spectacular Mahler festival in Leipzig. To hear all of Mahler's symphonies performed by 10 world-class orchestras will be a truly unique experience for all classical music lovers. Stay with us for more information. The latest album from the choir of St. John's College, Cambridge, available today from Signum, is a celebration of the rich heritage of the chapel's music and features two former directors of music as well as, of course, the current incumbent, Andrew Nethsingha, who joins me today. Now, your very beautiful new album, a celebration of the choir and the music written for it, has the title both simple and evocative of The Tree. And in the opening of the sleeve notes, you rather movingly capture how the album's very programme in many ways embodies the image of the title, starting with the seed of a single treble line from Hildegard von Bingen, back in the seeds really of the musical tradition we here celebrate, gradually adding organ, then lower voices, a second choir, 150 additional singers, and eventually combining nearly 500 voices in the final closing hymn. It's a very powerful image, so I thought I'd begin by asking, why this album, why this programme, and why now?
Well, that's lots of questions. Well, the tree. First of all, to take the title of the album, I suppose there are three ways in which that's sort of a metaphor for what's going on. You've just described one of them. Starting with a single line and gradually growing. I suppose there's also one is celebrating the choir itself, a tree which is always sprouting new branches and growing and. We've released the album, it's exactly 70 years this term since George Guest started running the choir, which is sort of the beginning of the period when it became a famous international choir. And it's also just after Christopher Robinson's 85th birthday and just before David Hill's 65th birthday. So, my three great predecessors are celebrating them.
We should say that normally when I'm talking to you, it's about an album you've entirely directed, but actually some of the works on here are directed by your predecessors.
Yeah, which is fantastic. So there are a couple of pieces from a joint service we did with the Yale Schola Cantorum, which David Hill is the director of, and also a sort of choir reunion evensong we had a couple of years ago, which Christopher Robinson conducted. And it is one of the greatest pleasures of my job, the occasions when David and Christopher come back and conduct the choir and watching them. It's very moving for me if I've managed to be successful in sort of retaining the ethos of the choir, seeing the way that they just sort of fits like a glove when they come back to it. That pleases me very much. And I suppose there's also the title of The Tree is taken from this piece by Jonathan Harvey. That's one of the tracks, and that's a text from the book of Job that talks about hope, which is so important to us now as we seek to all arts organisations or the whole world seeking to rebuild after the pandemic. There is hope for a tree if it be cut down. There is hope that it will sprout again and that its shoots will not cease. So it seems a very appropriate text for this time. So many reasons for the programme.
Yeah, I know. I love this image of a tree, those words of Job and the way you describe it. I mean, so many branches of a tree. I mean, in a way, a choir like yours embodies this even more than other organisations. So many branches producing forth musicians, bearing fruit, small blossoms that become in turn sort of solid branches in their own right, bearing the weight of the new buds to follow. I mean, because you have that nature of the choristers moving through every few years, undergraduates moving through every year, there is a sort of seasonality or a cyclicality which reflects the nature of that.
Absolutely, yeah. And actually, this disc ends with a hymn taken from that reunion song from July 2019. That was the very last service of the academic year for, I don't know, a dozen people or so who were leaving the choir. So that's sort of evocative of a particular moment. But I was just thinking on the train coming down this morning, one of the people for whom that was the last service was Hugh Cutting, who about 24 hours before us having this interview won the first prize in the Kathleen Ferrier Awards. Right. Here we are. There's another huge tree already.
Yeah.
So it's always renewing.
Absolutely. You mentioned the Jonathan Harvey piece, and I was struck that the album isn't chronological. You begin with probably the oldest work, and then we go straight to one of the newest, the Jonathan Harvey piece. And he was a composer who had a very strong relationship to St John's.
Yeah. He was a student at St John's. He was also a chorister at St Michael's Tenbury, a place dear to my heart, and actually overlapped with Christopher Robinson as a chorister there. But when Jonathan sadly died in 2012, and when we held a memorial service for him in chapel, he had asked that the service begin with a piece by Hildegard, which was an interesting choice, but which was sung by a solo soprano in the antechapel, and wonderful soaring melody, and so deeply spiritual as Jonathan himself was. So it was nice to have this juxtaposition of Hildegard and Harvey. Yeah. There's also a kind of it makes a nice sequence, I think, because there's obviously a weightlessness to a single monodic line sung by trebles, but equally the Harvey piece is just for trebles and organ, and all very high with no pedals. So you sort of you start suspended in the air.
No, absolutely. I mean, and the piece that follows that, James Long, younger composer, and this was another piece written for the college's 500th anniversary.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So that was 10 years ago this year, and we commissioned 5 pieces, I don't know, 500 years, 5 pieces, by John Rutter, James Macmillan, Jonathan Harvey, Judith Weir, and this piece by James Long. So there were 5 composers, all whose names began with J, but I think that was a coincidence. Anyway, some hugely distinguished names amongst them, obviously, but also James representing a new generation, and he'd been a student at King's, just graduated a couple of years before. It's a wonderful piece, I think, and I always encourage composers who write for us to consider writing for different sonorities, not necessarily just a cappella or with organ, but perhaps with a different instrument. We've even had pieces with marimba or electronics or choir and double bass or whatever, but James chose choir, organ and trumpet, and that's a wonderful sound world.
It is. I enjoy it very much because also from the perspective of listening to the record, the trumpet makes you very aware of different aspects of the chapel's acoustic, which is very exciting. And actually, speaking of the acoustic, one of the interesting things about this album is that almost everything on it was recorded live in a service in the chapel, and that was obviously quite important to you. Tell me about that.
Well, I suppose there have been these unique occasions, and if there is a particular service that has a frisson because it's the very last service of the academic year, for instance, you can't recreate that sort of frisson in a recording session necessarily. And also we had these wonderful groups of people. There's only been one service ever where our choir combined with Yale Schola Cantorum. I don't know when they'll next come, soon I hope, but it might be another decade. So you want to make the most of that, two very good choirs combining uniquely, and also getting back 200 former members of the choir. That's not something you can do every day. And having Christopher Robinson conducting those singers was just so inspiring, you know, to watch him conducting my own choir on its own, as it were, my trebles, who I had, you know, I rehearsed every day for 5 years, but then he comes in, genius like him, and adds many more degrees of magic and musicality and nuance and things, and it very, very moving, and that's all part of the continuity. You know, it's great for the great occasion for the younger singers to learn from the most eminent figures of the choir's past history.
No, absolutely. And the piece they recalled the praise and responses. I mean, I thought it would be interesting to talk about that. I mean, listening to them, they bring to mind the ancient plain chant, or the psalms, which are a part or heart even of evensong, and in themselves, their words, it's like a focus, a coming together of thought and prayer in the daily worship. They feel such an integral part of the story told by this album, and not least in Herbert House's beautiful settings.
That's lovely you say that. Well, he was clearly one of the, maybe the most important, or certainly one of the most important British composers of liturgical choral music in the 20th century. I mean, the most important in terms of settings of canticles, for instance. Everybody would agree with that, I think. In terms of the responses, which is another part of the service that is said or sung every day and has been since Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer in the 16th century. Different composers have set them. Now, the Howells setting is sometimes criticised for being a bit too sort of long and discursive and like an anthem in itself, rather than having the simplicity of just sort of answer and response that people expect. But I find it, I suppose the fact that it's a slightly longer work makes it particularly well suited to being on a recording, and I actually find it extremely beautiful in a service as well, because there's this extraordinary sort of numinosity that Howells gets. You know, it's like if you walk into one of the great French cathedrals and it's all a bit dark and there's a sort of smell of incense in the air, and you feel. You begin to feel you're in the presence of the divine, and some flickering candles and things, and there's an amazing way that Howells, to me, conjures, whether or not you're a believer, he seems to convey to his listeners this sense of being in a special place in the presence of something unusual. He lifts. If you're there in a service, his music can sort of lift you into another realm, like visiting an art gallery and turning your phone off and forgetting all your day-to-day concerns. I think he has an amazing ability to do that.
Because there is no one that fights for us, but only
Well, quite a lot of the repertoire on this album comes from the early decades of the 20th century. Howells we've talked about, but also Stanford and Parry and obviously slightly earlier than that, Stainer. But one of the works on Hear My Words, Ye People by Parry. Tell me about that work. It's the most substantial work in terms of length on the album.
It's a wonderful anthem written, I think, in 1894, and I suppose it's part of the great tradition of large-scale anthems that you might think of Purcell hosting Unto the Lord, one of those symphony anthems, or Wesley earlier in the 19th century writing things like Ascribe Unto the Lord, The Wilderness, and then later in the 20th century, Britain's Rejoice in the Lamb, Walton the 12, that kind of thing. So it sits in that tradition, I think. There's a wonderful big hymn at the end, so that perhaps relates it slightly to Lutheran tradition, cantatas and so forth, and there is a sense in which it's a sort of through composed but multi-movement work. But it was written for the Salisbury Diocesan Choral Festival, and these occasions still take place in cathedrals, though they're not as huge as they used to be. I mean, I think there were said to be sort of getting on for 2,000 singers for the first performance of this, and that was an annual festival. So people came from all over the diocese. Every parish church choir would come, and lots of special trains were laid on. Imagine that, isn't it fantastic?
Yes.
And there were brass and so forth, and the great Father Willis organ in Salisbury, one of the country's finest organs, that was only 17 years old or something at the time. So there's a brass group, and there's the cathedral choir, and there's this wonderful organ, and one or two soloists, and there's the mass choir of 2,000 voices. So you can sort of orchestrate the choirs in different ways, and there are wonderful effects between a small group and a large group. In our case, we did it with the present college choir, 30 singers or so, pitted against the sort of massed ranks of whatever it was, over 150. It's a very magnificent work. I think that really makes the most of the contrast in those voices.
Obviously this album is coming after a very difficult time after the COVID pandemic, and it's very poignant. You mentioned again in the sleeve notes that the choir had never previously been silenced, not even during the Second World War, when Herbert Howells acted as acting organist while Robin Orr was away on active service. And I wonder if you could reflect a little on that sort of forced interlude. Is it now a case of, that's over, just about, and onwards we go, or will it leave perhaps a legacy in the way you think about the choir and its place in the college's musical and spiritual life?
Well, I mean, it was a big sort of a change for all of us all over the world, and a sort of enforced period of reflection and not being able to do our normal activities. And I think we probably all we've all thought afresh about the main things in our life and what we do. So yeah, it's both the same now as it was before, and also different. But I think that, I suppose I won't know for quite a while, is just how long it takes for the choristers, for instance, who've lost such a huge part of their education. If they're choristers for 5 years, and we had at least 4 terms that were very disrupted, and that's many hundreds of hours of rehearsals and getting to know repertoire, and perhaps 200 services, and lots of concerts that they would have given around the place. All sorts of parts of their education that have got lost, musical education, and now we're trying to sort of catch up. They're doing extremely well at the moment, but it's tough being expected to do all these things to a very high standard without having had as much of the training as you would expect,
So. And one thing that lockdown did in chapels and churches globally was silence hymn singing, and so I thought it was a very glorious and unexpected way to end the album in the way that you have, with a hymn sung by hundreds of voices. I mean, like you, I missed congregational singing immensely during lockdown, so this did feel like a very beautiful and moving tribute to the place of music in church and chapel to end like this.
Yes. I think I'm not necessarily the greatest fan of say, albums that just consist of hymns or something, but this was such a special occasion, and I'm preparing the disc during one of our interminable lockdowns, when we hadn't heard that. I mean, it really brought tears to my eyes, and again, just that, that unique occasion. If we'd got 500 people in and had a recording session with them, it wouldn't have anything like this sort of thing. But it was a one-off thing.
Yes.
People singing their hearts off on this unique occasion. So yeah, it's very special. And Christopher conducting, and Christopher's desk hand and so forth, and such a wonderful hymn, the tune Blind Man, and some of the greatest hymn words, Love Divine by Charles Wesley. It's a great coming together. George Guest was such a fan of hymn singing, and really there's something about the building that helps you to hear each other and encourages everybody else to sort of sing more lustily in a way.
Tradition, and tradition necessarily evolves, and so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about the historic announcement made last month that St John's Choir, for its foundation, a male voice choir of boys and men, will henceforth be a mixed one with the welcoming of chorister girls and female adults.
Well, it's a very exciting new development, and I think I've always thought of my role in St John's as in a sense balancing tradition and innovation, and nobody is a greater fan of all the traditions of the choir and its particular characteristics than me, but equally I've tried, as George Guest and my other predecessors did, in our different ways. We've always tried to be innovative, whether through commissioning or repertoire or touring or webcasting or whatever. Yeah, well, we talked earlier about COVID and it being a time for reflection for all of us, and I suppose I reflected a lot about equality issues, and I do think it's such an amazing opportunity, educational experience that the choristers get in any cathedral or college, and I would say there are some ways in which the musical education at St John's, with its particular traditions and style, is unique in some ways, and it's just very sad not to allow girls to have that. I've been running choirs like this for more than 25 years now, and I don't think I can carry on anymore having boy choristers there and having their sisters sort of skulking behind pillars at the back, kind of every service for 5 years, because they're not allowed to even audition. We should, and also, you during COVID, you sort of think about what the most important things, issues to address in the world are, and we're all thinking about climate change at the moment. That's obviously one, and income inequality is another one, but it seems to me more than ever that gender inequality is it's such a terrible effect on our society, whether it's at the top of business or in politics or whatever. I mean, just everywhere you look, things are not quite everywhere, but in most places you look, things are male dominated, and men and women of my age are not always as good as we should be at acting together and treating each other as equals and treating each other with respect. And I'm very excited at the idea of having boys and girls together. The chorister education is an unusual well, other choirs do this, but it's unlike other things that happen in school, because you have 5 different year groups all existing in the same room, in the same space together. So 8 and 13-year-olds having the same classes, as it were, for a couple of hours a day, and the older ones nurturing the younger ones, and everyone being aware of each other's strengths and weaknesses, and encouraging each other and being kind to each other and supportive, and praising each other and it's a wonderful way that you make all these children sort of act as a team, and how much better to do that with boys and girls together. I think it'll be it'll obviously give new opportunities for girls, which is wonderful. I think it will also be a much sort of better education for boys, to be to be alongside the whole of society, not just half of it, and for them from a very young age to realise that we're all in this together and we're all equals. And I hope it's a tiny step in the scheme of things, but I hope little steps like this will help to make the world more equal in the future. And I hope I live long enough for some of my girl choristers as well as boy choristers to become famous composers and cathedral organists and conductors and so forth, just as previous boy choristers have.
I think that's
very exciting.
I think that's a very important point. I mean, so many of the people I interview, whether they're older recording artists or even things like the My Music page where we talk to people, but certainly musicians will often talk about that experience of being choristers or being choral scholars, but of course they're almost all men, and that's because that's historically how it was, and obviously we've seen the introduction of many choirs, including at Cambridge, places like Cats and Pembroke for girls, but this is quite a radical step, really, I suppose, in that it's the first time a choir of this nature has actually said, well, we're going to be mixed, we're going to be balanced.
That's the thing. I mean, the majority of cathedrals now have parallel boys and girls choirs, and there are one or two. So Manchester and St Mary's Edinburgh have had mixed treble lines for some time. We must acknowledge that, and Rochester Cathedral has just started doing that. So we're not unique, but I think we are the first choir of our type in a sort of university chapel, and if you had a separate, I obviously considered having separate boys and girls choirs, but it's much better just to have one choir and really to give everybody exactly the same experience, I think, rather than there being a danger of people saying, oh, that's the A choir and that's the B choir, and I think that the boys and girls will learn so much from each other, and people say, oh, is it going to sound different? Well, who knows? I mean, it's a great experiment. I think the sound will change less than some people think, but there are people who say, oh, boys and girls don't sound the same, and I get a bit irritated with that point of view, because what do boys sound like? Do they sound like my boys, or do they sound like boys trained by Richard Seal in Salisbury or by David Hill in Westminster Cathedral? They all sound totally different depending on who's in charge of them. What do girls sound like? Do they sound like Wells Cathedral under Malcolm Archer, or do they sound like a middle school choir or the National Youth Choir? Whatever, again, totally different sounds. So I think we're going to create a sort of a new mix, but in terms of the continuity of the choir style, I think so much of it is created by the personality of the director, by the tradition, by the acoustic of the building, by certain very distinctive approaches that we have to phrasing in our choir that all come from George Guest, by the particular sound world of the tenors and basses in that acoustic sort of permeating upwards. There are all sorts of things and stylistic things and approach to expressiveness in the psalms and text and things, and none of that's going to change. It'll be the same for boys and girls. So I think that the fundamental character of the choir will be very similar to what it's been in the past, but we'll add new dimensions. It's appropriate to have the tree. Of course, I was aware of all this kind of as I planned the CD, but it hadn't.
Yes.
I couldn't actually publish it at the time. But we've got here. We are such exciting new branches growing, but the existing branches continuing to flourish. I think it's an exciting time.
And obviously a lot of the debate about this has been people talking about how they feel about the choir, but what actually about the choristers? How did they feel when you told them about this news?
Well, that was an amazing occasion, actually. I mean, I didn't know what to expect. I was a little nervous telling them beforehand in case they reacted badly, but actually, I don't know, it was one of the most wonderful experiences of my life in a way, telling them, and I wish I'd videoed it because another unique moment. But I explained what was going to happen, and I explained the numbers were going to go up from 20 to 25, and that we were going to have girls as well as boys. And then when I sort of stopped and asked them whether they had any questions or concerns, and and feared that somebody might say, oh, well, girls can't sing like us, or something like that. There's absolutely none of that. One of them said, oh, if it's 25 instead of 20, that's an that's an odd number, not an even number. So one person had to stand in the middle when we process in, and if it's 25, not 20, we might need one extra bench in the rehearsal room. And somebody asked a question about toilets, which was a good one. And then there was a concern about chorister football, but I said I thought girls were quite good at football as well. But nothing else, because we've got such a wonderful school where, boys and girls do music together and drama together and art together and everything. So it's just normal to be coexisting in this way. So there were, the boys were very excited about being part of history in this way. So that's really lovely.
Well, it will be fascinating to hear the next branch of the tree bloom and grow, as it were. So the Tree, the new album from the choir of St John's College, Cambridge, is available now. Andrew Nethsingha, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Martin.
An excerpt from Secret Aquila by James Long, a work we talked about towards the beginning of our podcast, performed by the choir of St John's College, Cambridge, and their director of music, Andrew Nethsingha, my guest this week. And the choir's new album, The Tree, is available now on Signum. This Gramophone podcast is given in association with Leipzig, the city of music. From the 11th to the 29th of May 2023, the Gewandhaus Orchestra will host a Mahler Festival in Leipzig, the city that was home to the composer for 2 decisive years of his life and where he became the musician we know today, a composer of enthralling symphonies. The symphonic canon of Gustav Mahler forms the foundation of the Mahler Festival 2023. Leipzig and the Gewandhaus Orchestra offer a particularly authentic setting for the festival and a unique opportunity to hear the complete symphonies and other orchestral works interpreted by 10 world-class orchestras in Leipzig, the city of music. Full information at mahlerfestival.de. Gramophone podcasts are free, but if you enjoy them, then a really great way to support our work is to take out a subscription to Gramophone magazine, which is packed full of expert reviews and in-depth articles about the latest classical music releases every month. And if you head over to gramophone.co.uk/subscribe and enter the code podcast20 in the checkout, you can even get a 20% discount off any subscription package. We really value your support. And look out for another Gramophone podcast very soon.